In a dense forest, miles away from the nearest town, stood an old abandoned cabin that had long been the subject of local legends. Known as the Whispering Woods Cabin, it was said to be the site of numerous strange and unsettling occurrences. Despite these tales, or perhaps because of them, a group of friends decided to spend a weekend there, eager for a thrilling adventure. The group consisted of Sarah, an avid horror enthusiast, Jake, the skeptic, Lisa, always up for a dare, and Mark, who simply didn't believe in ghosts. They arrived at the cabin on a crisp autumn afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin, though dilapidated, retained a certain eerie charm with its moss-covered roof and broken windows. As they unpacked their gear and settled in, the forest seemed to close in around them. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Inside, the cabin was dusty and dimly lit, with old furniture shrouded in cobwebs. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, and faded photographs of long-gone occupants lined the walls. Night fell quickly in the forest. After a hearty meal cooked over a campfire, the group gathered in the living room, sharing ghost stories and laughter. Sarah suggested they play a game of truth or dare, and everyone agreed, hoping to lighten the spooky atmosphere. When it was Jake's turn, he chose dare. Sarah, with a mischievous grin, dared him to explore the basement alone. The group had already found the door to the basement but hadn't dared to open it. Jake, determined to prove his bravery, grabbed a flashlight and headed down the creaky stairs, the others trailing behind him until they reached the threshold. The basement was cold and damp, with a dirt floor and stone walls. The air smelled of mold and decay. As Jake stepped further in, the flashlight beam caught glimpses of old tools and broken furniture. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. He turned, startled, to see Sarah holding the door closed with a mischievous smirk. "Very funny, guys," Jake called out, trying to hide his nervousness. After a few minutes, Sarah let him out, and they all returned upstairs, laughing about the prank. But Jake couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched while he was down there. He decided to brush it off and rejoin the group for more games. As the night grew late, they decided to turn in. The cabin had only 2 bedrooms, so they paired off. Sarah with Lisa and Jake with Mark. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows, and the cabin creaked and groaned as if it were alive. Sarah found it thrilling, but the others were starting to feel uneasy. Around midnight, Lisa woke up to the sound of whispering. She sat up, straining to hear. The whispers seemed to come from all around, filling the room with an eerie, unintelligible murmur. She shook Sarah awake. "Do you hear that?" Sarah listened, her excitement giving way to fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the walls themselves. Trembling, they left their room to find the boys. Jake and Mark were already awake, having heard the same whispers. The group huddled together in the living room, the whispers now a constant background noise. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Jake, trying to regain his composure, suggested they investigate. They split into pairs again. Jake and Sarah headed to the basement while Lisa and Mark searched the attic. The basement seemed even colder than before, and the flashlight flickered as they descended. In the attic, Lisa and Mark found old trunks filled with rotting clothes and brittle papers. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the cabin, sending chills down their spines. They all rushed back to the living room, where they found Sarah trembling and pointing towards the basement door. I saw something. A figure. It just vanished." Mark, trying to calm everyone down, suggested they stick together and leave the cabin immediately. But as they approached the front door, it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard they tried, it was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. Panic set in, and the whispers began again, louder and more sinister. Desperate, they decided to try the windows, but they too seemed sealed by some unseen power. Trapped, they returned to the living room, trying to figure out what to do. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and shadows began to move across the walls. Jake, in a moment of clarity, remembered the local legend he had dismissed earlier. It was said that the cabin was built on sacred ground, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. The spirits of those who had been wronged or had died violently in the forest were said to haunt the cabin, seeking vengeance or release. Realizing they needed to appease the spirits, Sarah suggested they find something that might have belonged to them. They searched the cabin, finding old, personal items, a locket, a diary, a child's toy. They brought them to the living room and placed them in front of the fireplace. Mark, who had some knowledge of folklore, suggested they perform a ritual to honor the spirits. They held hands, closed their eyes, and spoke words of respect and apology. The whispers grew louder, then suddenly stopped. The cabin fell silent once more. Tentatively, they tried the door again. This time, it opened easily. They rushed outside, not stopping until they reached their car. As they drove away, the cabin stood silent and dark, its secrets hidden once more in the shadows of the forest. The friends never spoke of that night again, but they all knew they had narrowly escaped something beyond their understanding. The Whispering Woods cabin remained a place of mystery and fear, a dark legend in the heart of the forest. And those who dared to enter would always feel the eyes of the forest upon them, watching, waiting. In the heart of the dense, untouched wilderness known as Blackwood Forest, there was a path that locals warned never to tread. The path, shrouded in dense fog and shadowed by ancient, gnarled trees, was known as the Trail of Shadows. Legends told of those who ventured down it never returning, their whispers carried on the wind, merging with the rustling leaves and creaking branches. Determined to debunk these myths, a group of urban explorers, Tom, Alex, Mia, and Sophie, decided to document their journey into Blackwood Forest and specifically down the Trail of Shadows. They arrived on a crisp fall morning, the ground carpeted with golden leaves and the air thick with an eerie stillness. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and camping gear, they set off down the trail. At first, the path seemed like any other, winding through tall pines and oaks, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. But as they progressed, the forest grew darker, the trees denser, and an oppressive silence fell over them. Even the birdsong that had greeted their arrival was now absent, leaving only the crunch of leaves underfoot and their own nervous breathing. After several hours, they came across an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, its roof sagging and windows shattered. Despite the uneasy feeling that gnawed at them, curiosity won out, and they decided to investigate. The cabin's door creaked loudly as they pushed it open, revealing a room thick with dust and cobwebs. Old, decaying furniture was strewn about, and the remnants of a fire lay cold in the fireplace. On a whim, Mia pulled out her camera and began filming, narrating their findings for their audience. Suddenly, Sophie gasped and pointed to a corner of the room. There, scratched into the wooden wall, were symbols none of them recognized, alongside deep gouges as if something with sharp claws had attacked the wood. Tom, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off as the work of vandals, but a shiver ran down Mia's spine. As they explored further, they found an old, leather-bound journal buried under rubble. The writing was barely legible, the ink faded with time, but they could make out frantic entries about strange sounds at night, shadows moving in the woods, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Just as Alex began reading one particularly disturbing passage aloud, a sudden loud thud echoed from the attic above them. They all froze, exchanging nervous glances. Summoning their courage, they decided to investigate, their footsteps creaking loudly on the wooden stairs. The attic was even more decrepit than the rest of the cabin, with beams of light cutting through the broken roof, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. In the far corner, something moved, a shadow shifting just out of the reach of their flashlights. "Who's there?" Tom called out, his voice trembling despite his attempts to sound brave. There was no response, only the oppressive silence and the feeling of being watched. They backed out of the attic, the sense of dread growing with every step. Back on the ground floor, they decided it was time to leave. The sun was setting, and the idea of spending the night in the haunted cabin was unbearable. As they stepped outside, they realized the forest had grown darker, the fog thicker, and the path they had followed seemed to twist and turn in ways they didn't remember. They hurried back towards the trail, but it wasn't long before they realized they were lost. Every direction looked the same, the towering trees and dense underbrush disorienting them. Panic set in as night fell, and the forest came alive with strange sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and the distant call of animals. Desperate, they pitched their tents in a small clearing, hoping to find their way back in the morning. They built a small fire, its flickering light providing little comfort against the darkness pressing in around them. As they sat in silence, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. In the middle of the night, Sophie woke to the sound of whispering. She sat up, straining to hear, but the whispers seemed to come from all around, indistinguishable from the wind. She woke the others, and they huddled together, their flashlights scanning the darkness. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, a tall, shadowy silhouette that seemed to flicker like a flame. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight. Mia screamed, and the figure vanished, leaving only the echo of their fear. They spent the rest of the night wide awake, every sound and shadow putting them on edge. As dawn broke, they quickly packed up and continued their search for the trail, exhaustion and fear driving them. Hours passed with no sign of the path, their spirits sinking lower with each step. Just as they were about to give up hope, they stumbled upon another cabin, this one in even worse condition than the first. Desperation pushing them forward, they entered hoping to find something, anything, that could help them. Inside, they found more of the strange symbols and claw marks, but this time there were also old photographs scattered across the floor. The photos showed people standing in front of the cabin, their faces blurred and eyes blank. Among the photos was one of the journal they had found earlier, open to a page depicting a map of the forest. Following the map, they realized it showed a way out of the forest. With renewed hope, they set off, keeping a close eye on the landmarks indicated on the map. The forest seemed to resist their progress, with brambles and fallen trees blocking their way, but they pressed on. As night fell again, they saw a faint light in the distance. Pushing through the last stretch of forest, they emerged onto a familiar path, the Trail of Shadows. Relief washed over them, but their ordeal was not yet over. They followed the trail back to where they had started, only to find their car covered in a thick layer of dirt and leaves, as if it had been abandoned for years. Exhausted and disoriented, they piled in and drove away, leaving Blackwood Forest and its dark secrets behind. Back in the safety of their homes, they reviewed the footage they had taken. To their horror, the videos showed not just their exploration, but shadowy figures watching them, following them. In some clips, whispers could be heard, repeating their names and urging them to leave. Haunted by their experiences, they each tried to move on, but the memories of Blackwood Forest lingered. They knew they had encountered something beyond their understanding, something that lived in the shadows of the ancient woods. And they knew that those who ventured into the Trail of Shadows might never truly escape its grasp.